why are CISOs looking for technical guidance? Why are they jumping to this information that, as we know, was targeted at different audiences? And I think it comes down to this, which is it's really struggling with navigating what is today sort of this jungle of AI and risks, both in terms of where they need to start. So many people didn't have a place to start, so the top 10 offered an opportunity to be a place to start. From that, we've had opportunities to engage with more CISOs, to provide more feedback into that. And so I'm going to go through today a little bit about some of the guidance and feedback that we've received, and I'll go through also at a top level what the checklist is and give you some examples of what's in it. We won't go through it in great detail because it's a document you can read, but I want to make sure we kind of highlight so you have an idea of what's contained within this. And again, I think that what really started this was, as we all know, the expanded risks that we're dealing with. It's bringing together different groups. We had that question just a minute ago around, is it the AppSec team's problem?
Yeah.
Partially, what I think was our answer, but it's a broader issue, and in some ways we're still defining whose responsibility it is. As we started to create this framing around the architecture where the challenges are, it started to uncover different areas that we need to look at. Obviously, there's new threat vectors that are happening all the time, both from an insider perspective. We talked about prompt injection being one of the top things that people are looking at. A lot of times that is coming from an internal usage. If you hear what a recent statistic I heard, I think it was yesterday, that 75% of employees are using ChatGPT or AI tools, whether they have been given permission or not. They're using them today. That means that there is data that is flowing out there potentially that is putting organizations at risk. At the same time, we're struggling with the idea that Steve highlighted with tape, and with our recent challenges around some of the risks around AI that have come out, some of the announcements. It's really the speed of evolution that's happening. How do we build and create a framework for trustworthy AI? So it's securing AI, but when we think about security, I think it's a broader context than just AppSec, network, applications. To really, how do we start to think about a trustworthy AI platform framework and business processes around it? Everybody knows they need to do things around here, but it's understanding how do we start to structure this. This has come through very clearly from a lot of the feedback from the CISOs, as we've been getting additional feedback as we kind of continue to move forward, but building something that's around these three tenets that are around reliable, that are repeatable and resilient, are sort of the core tenets of how we start to need to think about and incorporate that into our security strategy. So again, it's not just about the applications, it's about how do we build a whole trustworthy platform, processes, infrastructure, and education for end users and organizations. So again, this comes back to when our feedback we got from CISOs that really drove, I think, Sandy's first cut at this, which is everybody knows the components that we need to bring together here. It's not new in terms of people, process, and technology, but it's understanding how to start to apply those in the context of the LLM and in generative AI. So the top 10 provides, again, a framework for us to understand the risks. But as we talked about, we want to start being more proactive and helping people provide more guidance that perhaps goes beyond that so they have tactical tools to work. So how do we start to incorporate people, process, technology, build frameworks and techniques to help move organizations from where we are today, which is very nascent, in terms of organizations' understanding and ability to address these challenges, to a point where they have more of a framework as we kind of move forward. So out of that came, in our research, came this basic need, and we talked about it just a minute ago, where it's, again, coming back to this point of needing not just the AppSec team, but also other teams as part of this. Phone, yes, get your phone, that's important. So the feedback we've gotten is that it really does, I hate to say this term, but take a village to kind of address this issue. The AppSec team is, and the security community ourselves are in a unique position to have addressed these in different forms in the past. But it also means that we also have to bring together different parts of the organization. We may have had, for example, we may have had security analysts working with it, but we also need to bring together data scientists in the team. Building a center of excellence where we have human resources, IT and operations. We have different representations across the organization because there are policies, there are processes, and there are technologies that apply in each of these. At the same time, putting together a COE means making sure you have integration with your users and customers as part of that. So building a team that can look at this on an ongoing basis becomes sort of an essential component of taking some of those first steps. We've seen this be successful in the past in other new technology adoption areas. So this is not, the idea of a COE is not new, but the idea of including the breadth of organizations and contributors into that COE with generative AI and LLMs is a much broader inclusion for that. So as we talked about, we want to talk a little bit about the checklist. We'll dive into that just a little bit more. So what is the checklist? How do we get to this point? So again, it comes back to that need to provide additional insight and an initial set of steps for the CISOs and non-CISOs who are kind of looking to prioritize what are their next steps from an IT perspective or security perspective. The checklist is really designed to give that simple approach to how do we start to move forward in these areas. Today, we're dealing with really 4 basic challenges that organizations are dealing with. This is currently, it's an asymmetrical warfare. So we're talking about earlier using generative AI both as an attacker scenario as also as a user. So there's a scenario here where we are challenged with this concept of the symmetrical warfare that we're constantly trying to figure out. How do I start to adapt my organization from a CISO perspective, for a checklist perspective, and how do I start to address that in a simple way? The other is looking at the attack surface obviously has been broadened. So what are those new components of the attack surface that we need to be considering as part of our strategy? And as we talked about it before, Gen AI is both that benefit and the curse, right? So the benefit, obviously, that the organizations come to it, but the risks that it presents as the organizations start to adopt it. So how can I be successful in adopting Gen AI and LLMs? Yeah. So the top 10 list is not just about what not to do or how to defend against it, but one of the most important things for organizations is how can I adopt it responsibly? How can I adopt it safely? Because competitors are doing it. It's a competitive differentiator for a lot of organizations. It's enabling new types of capabilities, but at the same time, it's creating new types of risks. So when we started to look at Sandy looked at the checklist, it was as much about how to protect as it was to how to enable organizations to adopt. Because if we're simply on the fence helping to block things, that's not going to necessarily help organizations create value. So the approach that was taken was using sort of the OWASP loop to try to make sure we're doing an iterative process on looking at everything from the attack to observe to decide to be able to build a framework that is consistent and usable as organizations try to figure out where they could start. So the checklist itself is a checklist of a few key things but again, they cross across organizational boundaries. And this is a theme that you'll see over and over again, is this need to consider something beyond, say, the AppSec side. And I think this is where a lot of the interest came from, but go beyond to engage other parts of the organization and other parts of the industry to kind of figure out how you're going to address these. So we'll go through a few of these as we for the checklist. So adversarial risk. Now, again, I'm not going to go through all the details. You can download the document. You can go to lom.owasp.org, and there's a great place you can download the document and go into detail. But I do want to highlight a few things as we go through it when we start talking about what do we mean by adversarial risk. And this is what I talked about a moment ago. It's not just including the defending against it is not just the attackers, but also focusing on how to drive adoption. So making sure you're also looking at the competitive perspective. Look at how your competitors are addressing and how they are investing in AI, because it is a competitive differentiator. And making that part of your strategy and part of your checklist is an important component of that. The obvious area around updating your incident response plan. Clearly, that's an area that everybody is trying to figure out how to do right now. But that's a first step in helping to build this set of behaviors and best practices in creating that first step in defending against the generative AI. The other area that becomes central to this is threat modeling. Being able to look at and we'll have some discussions a little bit later around with the panel talking about red teaming and how to start to do both your threat modeling and how to do proactive red teaming to defend both your existing applications as well as detect and neutralize any kind of malicious kind of inputs, queries, ways to kind of protect the infrastructure and make sure that you can build a framework that can be defensive. Understand how they're going to exploit attacks and incorporate that into your defense scenarios. Make sure that you can deal with all access. Access is another component that's really important. Obviously, identity becomes a core component of that, making sure that you can access data, but more importantly, who has access to your intellectual property, and how do you manage that intellectual property usage both within your organization for using with the chat, using with generative AI, and also in applications that you're building. We'll see data lineage and data become a much more focused point of the application stack with generative AI than some of the other components previously. Another component that we're looking at is the asset inventory. So just as with any application you're looking to understand all of the assets that are going to be part of your application stack, part of your applications. In this case, you also need to make sure you're really focused heavily on the data sources. So when we talk about application security, we're often not really talking about the data level. We're talking about certainly data injection, but from the idea of data lineage. Things that have been traditionally in the boundaries of data management are now much more a central component of what you need to incorporate in your security strategy when it comes to generative AI. You also need to validate third-party solutions. So we talked a little bit about supply chain being an important vector of risk. So supply chain security is another component of building your asset inventory, not only understanding your current assets, but also their lineage, where they come from, and then how you can establish some best practices around ensuring their fit. Lastly, bill of materials. So we've had a software bill of materials. When you think about AI applications, it's software. And that software becomes important to be able to manage that. Today's bill of materials doesn't necessarily consider all the aspects from an AI perspective. Today, working with the Cyclone DX and other projects to start to extend capabilities to support AI within your SBOMs. So as we move forward, that's a key component when you're putting together your overall asset inventory. Because once you roll these out and you run into some of the challenges that Steve highlighted earlier, you have to be able to understand where those risks came from and be able to map back both data lineage and supply chain issues. One of the other components here is obviously the security and privacy training. So that becomes a component as well as we're starting to build an overall strategy for educating the organization. It's not just about the defensive techniques, but it's also about making sure that we're getting the end users part of the education process. Just as I mentioned before, in the COE, it includes both our technical constituents as well as our end user constituents, and being able to effectively ensure everybody has policies well defined, being educated on the risks, and build that culture of open and transparent communication. So again, coming back to the people component of this, it's an important part to make sure those communication is being open, the education is happening, and that's going to be an important part of ensuring protection and privacy and security. Just as you currently have existing programs that are focused on security training, it would be really simple to start to extend those programs with AI training to be able to make that part of their regular education. We talked about it before also, the setting clear business use cases. So again, the checklist is as much about setting up ways to defend as it is ways to adopt. And part of that adoption is ensuring we've got clear defined use cases to create value for the organization, whether that's around enhanced innovation or whether that's around enhancing customer experiences. Today, a lot of AI has been applied to customer experience through chatbots, through customer support examples. But as we start to see that create the use for content creation, understanding those business cases and having a good way to articulate that to the organization, both in terms of value and protection, are important as you start to build out your own personal checklist. Again, governance is another area that's essential to this, to protecting your organization. This includes the transparency and accountability that needs to be there as part of your checklist, ensuring that you are aligning your data management practices. As I mentioned before, data management, when we talk about AppSec, we often don't incorporate the data as much as an essential part as it is today. But the sources of data, the ability to manage and implement data management policies are all really critical to this new set of vectors you need to be checking as part of building your own checklist. You need to be able to document, assign AI risk. So look at your existing assets, make sure that you have you've identified where there could be risk in the organization, and make sure you have identified responsibility for that so that there are people who are responsible. Yes. Yeah, so the question was, is there a need to bring the checklist together between NIST and between what we're putting together? And what I would say is that we're working with the NIST on the checklist and understanding from them what needs to be part of it. So I think that the answer would be today both. This is you can start with the checklist that we have as a starting point, and then incorporate this part of that as a kind of list part. Other team that needs to be part of this is legal. So as we talked about, legal implications here are significant. Everything from reviewing your EULA organizations, EULA agreements from AI products that you are using or incorporating, to understanding even the customer EULAs. So you're going to need to, if you're offering products or you're offering services, you're going to need to make sure your EULAs include components around how you're using AI, how you're using AI data, and what that lineage looks like. You need to look at liability, understand your liability as it relates to your assets and requirements. That also becomes an important component of building your overall framework. So regulatory, we talked about the EU Act that's kind of in process right now. So in terms of really formalizing a lot of the guidance around it. Right now, it's really going to be important to make sure we track this. This is all happening, this is new in terms of the regulatory frameworks that are coming. Obviously, the EU is probably going to be one of the ones that are more directly impactful for organizations. We think about the larger context, but we also need to look at, any of the tools that might be considered for hiring management. We also need to look at documenting any of the products. So you need to look at the entire life cycle of how you're engaging with AI and your applications to map into what regulatory requirements that you may need to be able to support as well. Another area we cover is usage and implementation. So again, this comes down to a lot of what's familiar to us, training around your pipeline security, understanding your input and outputs, evaluating those inputs and methods, and setting up a framework so that you can have answers to these questions when you're working through the different parts of the organization through your COE. You've got well-defined boundaries and trust boundaries for your LLM within your threat models. We talked earlier about updating the guidance around your threat modeling and direction. Testing and evaluation. We're working with NIST. We're working with other organizations. So in this case, NIST is definitely requiring a TEVV approach to your AI infrastructure. It's that continuous testing and monitoring across a range of tasks. And so that becomes an essential part of what we're building together or looking to do as part of your overall checklist. One thing that's new, or maybe not so new to some, how many people are familiar with risk cards? So risk cards, so we all know about model cards. Model cards are a way to kind of characterize what are in the models that we're dealing with. Risk cards are a new component that's been added fairly recently and starting to understand the specific risks that are attached to a model. So it's making sure that you are documenting your models effectively and adopting things like the risk card approach to characterize a framework for the risk for that particular model. Some models have started to publish these risk cards, but as you develop or extend models for your own organizations, being able to put this in as a best practice when building applications to make sure you have a risk card built and maintained is a key component of helping you to make sure you've got your overall checklist in place. RAG model optimization. I won't go into great detail here. We have much more detail on the checklist, but it's essential that you're creating those feedback loops. Again, a lot of this comes back to documentation, making sure that you've got policies in place to implement quality controls for data and tracking of data retrieval, so that you have a source of truth for where data comes from as you start to address issues around if you run into any issues with your models as you start to develop them. And last thing, make sure that you do have a red teaming plan. You already have red teaming happening within your organization, but start to focus on these AI systems. And we'll talk about it a little bit later today is how your people can leverage AI systems to do their red teaming, both looking at attack scenarios against applications and then also specifically against AI systems. So the team will talk a little bit about that more in detail today. So kind of thinking about the next steps here when you look at the checklist and what goes forward here to help you be more secure around the AI platforms. Number one, you need to understand those risks and opportunities, both the business cases that are creating value for the organization and the risks those present. Second, build that COE. So you have that multidiscipline COE to help you to get the right people on the table, to clear those lines of communication and ensure that you have the policies and approaches in place to be able to implement and coordinate across, because these are different groups that we've had traditionally before that need to be part of this discussion and be part of your planning. Build your checklist. So everybody's checklist is going to be a little bit different, but the checklist from OWASP gives you a framework to be able to develop that checklist. Start with it, extend it, actually even contribute back to the community. One of the things that are essential for us as we start to move this forward, as Stephen mentioned, is contribution and participation from the community. So these are public documents and open source resources So we want to have more input and collaboration from the community coming back into the checklist. So just as using the checklist to start, it's a little advertisement for also contributing back. So this provides you a good opportunity to start and to get started around it. And then from your own strategy perspective, implement your own sort of OWASP approach toward operationalizing the strategy. Make sure that you're reviewing it. Make sure that you're working on the execution of it. Make sure that that's part of your overall approach. So when I saw someone coming up further, take another snap of this. So once again, kind of promote the user. So if you want to get engaged, want to start participating, we're working on the next version of the checklist. It's a live document. It's always being updated. I know Sandy's getting ready to kick off another version of that. So we'd love to have you guys jump in, be part of the process, and help us kind of move it to the next 2.0 level. Just as we've done with the LLM top 10 list, this is another great way to kind of be part of this community, leverage your expertise, and help us to kind of address these issues amongst our peers.
Thank you.
So that